I'm ready, but I've done what I need to do. So.
Okay, great. So we will start now. So hello, everybody, and welcome to this new Zoom panel organized by the International Manifesto Group on the case against NATO. My name is Radhika Desai. I'm speaking to you from Winnipeg, which is the homeland of which sits on the stolen lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji Cree, and the Dakota and the Dene peoples, and is also the homeland of the Métis Nation. The title of our talk, of our panel today, is "The Case Against NATO." When has there not been a case against NATO? We've been told that it's a defensive alliance. Really, it's been responsible for pretty well the disproportionate amount of aggression around the world. We've been told it has increased security, but we find ourselves in the middle of one of the most dangerous wars since the end of the Second World War. We have been told it's necessary, but there are lots of things, including the ignominious withdrawal from Afghanistan, which make us wonder whether it is. The entire history of NATO says otherwise. In 1949, there was a case against NATO because it was in fact the US's instrument to get itself in Europe, keep the Germans down and the Russians out, as Lord Ismay is said to have remarked before he became Secretary General of NATO. In fact, of course, this was just the US muscling in on the Europeans who had, through the treaties of Dunkirk and Brussels, been trying to protect themselves against a potentially resurgent Germany. There was a case against NATO when Germany's entry finally pointed its guns at the Soviet Union and brought the Cold War to Europe, prompting the Soviet Union to create the Warsaw Pact and essentially doing this, even though up until then the Soviet posture was entirely defensive. There was a case against NATO throughout the Cold War when it prompted an arms race and a nuclear arms race with entirely fantastical ideas about Soviet expansionism. There was a case against NATO in the 60s and 70s when détente was deepening economic, political, diplomatic relations across the Cold War divide, and when France left its military command. There was a case against NATO above all in 1989 when the West made its promises to Gorbachev to say that NATO would not expand one single inch beyond absorbing East Germany. And in fact, for a long time, for months, Western sources have been saying, oh, there was no promise or blah, blah, and so on. In fact, we now have documentary proof that such a promise was made. And this comes from many different sources. There was a case against NATO. Since then, there has been a case against NATO more or less continuously, as it has been heightening tensions, increasing military expenditures and military actions, and also burdening countries such as Greece that can barely afford such expenditures. There was a case against NATO in 2001 when for the first time Article 5 was invoked and NATO as an alliance entered Afghanistan, only to leave it 20 years later with completely ignominious results, leaving Afghanistan much worse than it had been before. There has been a case against NATO each time it has expanded eastward, endangering European security, including by offering membership to Georgia and NATO. There was a case against NATO in 2021 when President Biden, newly elected, began to make it an instrument for his alleged project for uniting alleged democracies, when in fact they had been reduced to hollow electoral shells, and things were the worst perhaps in the United States itself. And since then, President Biden has been trying to make it into an instrument for imposing the US's own laws, which it calls international law, which it calls the rules-based international order, which goes directly against the United Nations Charter and much international law. And finally, in 2022, there is a very strong case against NATO because it has provoked the current war over Ukraine, which the majority of the world does not agree with, and which it seems the US now plans to extend to Asia by clearly contemplating a new confrontation with China over Taiwan, modeled on the confrontation with Russia over Ukraine. And this is bound to ruin the security of the world's most economically dynamic region. There has been a case against NATO throughout its history because it has simply the wrong idea about how to promote peace. You cannot promote peace through aggression, but through the promotion of viable economies, equal, prosperous economies that work to mutual benefit. So, folks, with us to talk about this very important subject, we have an excellent panel, and I'm going to introduce each speaker one by one. Each speaker will speak for about 10 minutes. Since we have 7 speakers, that will take us to about a little over an hour, and then we will have time for questions and answers, and we look forward to a really good discussion. So, our first speaker is Kate Hudson. Kate is General Secretary of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament in the UK. She has held that post since September 2010, having previously been chair of the campaign since 2003. She's a leading anti-nuclear and anti-war campaigner nationally and internationally. She's also the author of a very important history of CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, which is entitled CND Now More Than Ever, the Story of the Peace Movement. So, Kate, please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Radhika, and thank you for that very comprehensive and useful overview. So, as we make the case against NATO, the particular charge I would like to make is that it is driving the world towards nuclear war. When NATO leaders met last month for an emergency meeting to discuss Russia's invasion of Ukraine, they responded with the continuation and intensification of NATO's policies of the last 30 years, which of course have done so much to foment the current catastrophe in Ukraine. The summit declaration announced the deployment of the NATO response force and an additional 40,000 troops on NATO's eastern border, along with so-called significant air and naval assets, as well as establishing 4 additional multinational battle groups in Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, and Slovakia. And they're also accelerating plans for a new strategic concept document due to be unveiled at the next NATO summit in Madrid in June. Every strategic concept and heads of state summit since 1999 has involved an expansion of NATO's territorial and global reach, more money poured into weapons development and procurement, and more scenarios for intervention. Through this unfolding process, NATO has undertaken its massive expansion into being a global force. In 2019, it even declared space to be an operational domain. Its summit last year expanded NATO's orientation to the Asia-Pacific, specifically to confront China. It also reinforced the so-called open door policy, the pursuit of expansion that is causing so much trouble. NATO is likely to double down on its hostility to and encirclement of Russia and China, building regional alliances and ramping up the ideological rhetoric and narrative about freedom, which overlooks NATO's brutal warfighting and interventionist record. Last month's statement also pledged to, quotes, significantly strengthen our longer-term deterrence and defence posture. Given that deterrence is a euphemism for nuclear weapons, this is very alarming. So where will this take us in nuclear terms? There are already enough nuclear weapons in the world to destroy everything many times over. NATO and Russia have 12,000 nuclear weapons between them. Today's bombs are vastly bigger than the Hiroshima bomb, which exploded with the power of approximately 15 kilotons of TNT, killing at least 200,000 people. In today's terminology, the Hiroshima bomb would be called low yield. Many of the world's larger warheads weigh in at around 800 kilotons. The US also has around 150 free-fall nuclear bombs, in other words, they're dropped from planes, located across Europe and assigned to NATO. They are currently being modernized. And these weapons have a variable yield up to 170 kilotons, and they allow for both strategic and tactical use, in other words, long and short range. In the event of a nuclear exchange over Ukraine, I think these are the most likely to be used, certainly to start off with. The very bad news from last week is that these weapons are now likely to be brought back to Britain. 110 were removed in 2008. So this is a major escalatory step, bringing more NATO nukes into Western Europe. Our worst fear in the 1980s was that a Soviet-NATO nuclear war would be fought in Europe. And that was when millions mobilized against cruise and Pershing missiles. That is now a very real risk once again. Another increasing danger is presented by policies on nuclear use. Recent narratives, and indeed practice, refer to usable nukes or low-yield nuclear weapons, ending the previous taboo on nuclear use and the idea that the certainty of mutually assured destruction would prevent them being fired. There's a lot of talk now of tactical nuclear weapons or battlefield nukes, as if they are somehow not very dangerous. This is irresponsible and wrong. Not only would they do massive unrestricted damage, but would be likely to lead to escalation to larger nuclear weapons use. Also, the scenarios in which nuclear could be used have been extended, including by Britain. That was announced in its integrated review last year, at the same time as the British government announced a big increase in the UK's nuclear arsenal. As the invasion began on the 24th of February, around 1,000 Russian nuclear weapons and a similar number of US, British and French nuclear forces assigned to NATO were already on prompt launch high alert status. And that's the normal situation. Most high alert missiles are armed with strategic nuclear weapons with yields of at least 100 kilotons. They can be launched in 15 minutes, and the flight time of intercontinental ballistic missiles carrying these weapons traveling between the US and Russia is around half an hour. So what is the possibility of the Ukraine war turning nuclear? If the war expands into a direct conflict between NATO and Russia, then it becomes a likelihood rather than a possibility. A no-fly zone is the most rapid route to nuclear war. Breach of a NATO-imposed no-fly zone over Ukraine would lead to a direct Russia-NATO war. Moving of heavy weaponry into eastern Ukraine can have the same consequence, and senior military figures warn that this can lead to World War III. The war has already altered the political balance in Europe and is accelerating its militarization. This will have a profoundly negative impact on our societies, engendering a culture of violence and nationalism. For years, there had been talk of the increasing militarization of the EU, encouraged by the US, basically to input more resources into NATO. But in fact, there had been little progress. But now that has changed. Germany, for example, has undertaken a huge about turn towards war and militarism. So more and more of the people's money will be squandered on weapons and war, instead of being invested in health, jobs, and education. It has often been said that NATO is the means by which the US makes Europe pay for its wars and its drive for global military hegemony. That is more so the case than ever, and it brings with it ever greater dangers of nuclear annihilation. CND, along with the rest of the international peace movement, has long argued instead for a new common security framework in Europe, not massively increasing militarization. Despite the fog of war, it is vital that we work towards outcomes that enable a just and lasting peace in the region and in the wider world. Only dialogue and negotiation, taking into account the wider context of this conflict and the legitimate security interests of us all, can bring that about in a way that will enable a genuinely secure future for humanity. And nuclear disarmament must be at its heart. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny. I'm afraid we are having a difficulty with a couple of the speakers who were in fact listed immediately after Kate. Or we were hoping to have immediately after Kate. So I just want to make sure, Carlos, Ron, are you willing to go next?
Sure thing. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, so let me just quickly introduce you and then please have the floor. Thank you so much for jumping in a bit earlier than expected. So Carlos Ron, who is our next speaker, is Venezuela's Deputy Foreign Minister for North America. And he's also the president of the Simon Bolivar Institute for Peace and Solidarity Among Peoples. There are, like Kate, few other people, in fact, like most of our speakers, but still there are few other people who are more qualified to speak about the dangers that NATO represents, particularly from the point of view of the third world and also from the point of view of countries like Venezuela, against which the wrath of the United States has been rained for so long and so severely. Carlos, please go ahead.
Yes, well, thank you very much. And again, it's a pleasure to be able to be with you on a day like this and to discuss these very important issues for us. I wanted to, I know a lot of the speakers will concentrate on current issues, particularly near or in the area of Ukraine and Russia. And I will just say a few words on that, but I would try to concentrate more from the Latin American perspective of NATO's influence. In general terms, though, I would like to say that here in Venezuela we have recognized and that the role that NATO has played in not only in the current situation, specifically since February, March events, but throughout all this history of Europe, has been a role of not only for NATO, but really for the US policy of domination and imperialism throughout the world. This is important because we must not forget this when we analyze current events and when we analyze the impact that they are going to that they want to have in a larger world scenario. I say this because we've been speaking for several months now on this emergence of a new Cold War type of scenario and attitude, where the United States, in its dispute with other powers around the world, but in particularly with its dispute with China, needed to recompose its stance in the world, and particularly on the Atlantic, as the administration of Donald Trump left several weaknesses in the traditional U.S. alliance. So it was no surprise, at least from our perspective, it was no surprise that a new conflict opens up in Europe, where the United States is attempting to rally again its allies in the Atlantic, allies that have for different reasons distanced themselves from the United States or did not follow the exact policies expected from them by the U.S. administrations. This means that what we're seeing now, this completely changed in a couple, has been changing in the last several weeks, and now we see again this closer ties and closer following of Europe and towards the United States. And what we think is, when we see is, this is not only an issue of the U.S. Trying to take a position against Russia and affect Russia in general terms. But I think we must see it as a longer term initiative that will rally U.S. and establish its domination over the Atlantic alliances or the Atlantic countries that influences not only in Europe but also in Latin America, looking towards a greater possible conflict in the future where China would also be involved. I think in this, we must see this as in that wider range of analysis. We have, from Venezuela, we have always maintained a very strong position in favor of peace because we believe in diplomacy. We have been establishing with other nations a group of friends of the United Nations Charter, whose intention of this group is to defend, the principles of diplomacy, to defend the idea of multilateralism, and that we can always come back and find a way to come back to the negotiations, the diplomatic negotiations, in order to avoid war, as was the original intent of the United Nations. So we, of course, wish, and we say this from Venezuela, that we hope that there are solutions to be found, and that peace is of course, that it can be imposed in the region, but we cannot overlook how NATO has been provoking, has been giving the conditions so that peace is not achieved. Because rather than a strong display of diplomatic actions that would have brought, that might have helped bring this to this current conflict in Ukraine to a more rational solution that avoided conflict. What you see from NATO is, more promotion of war. You see more weapons being sent. So you see that the role that NATO has been taking now, as it has been for the last decades, is still a role of promoting war and promoting benefit for the industrial war machines, the industrial producers of weapons, to continue with their business and renew their technologies. In Latin America in general, and I think this is something that we should look at carefully. In Latin America in general, what has been our concern of most recent is this idea that Colombia, which is a neighbor to Venezuela, has become a global partner of NATO. Now, as we understand this, the global partner is not a full member, meaning that they're not bound by Article 5 to be defended in case of aggression. They have no other input on the decisions, the large decisions that are taken by NATO as an organization. This is actually not even something that is consulted, to my understanding, that is consulted to NATO members in general, but it's actually decided by the US Congress. This idea of giving them this global partner status. But it is still, I believe, a dangerous label, because it allows the country, or the government in that country at this time, which we know has been a government that has been hostile to Venezuela in all possible terms. It allows this government this Colombian government of President Duque, to now claim he has some sort of support and have some sort of mandate from NATO to carry out whatever policies they want to do with regards towards Venezuela. This is something that is, of course, because of this history of hostility, something that we believe is very dangerous. Now, if we go back to the history of Colombia to understand what the meaning of this is, we have to put this in context, that this is not the first time that Colombia is partnering with the United States or with its allied forces, but rather this is something that has been going on ever since the 1960s, when the Civil War broke out in Colombia. And Colombia, as you know, is in a very strategic place in Latin America. It's located where South America meets Central America. It has both an exit towards the Atlantic as well as towards the Pacific Ocean, and of course there's a lot of minerals that Colombia itself has, but also it's in large proximity to the world's largest oil reserve, which is in Venezuela, and great sources of water that are located both in Venezuela, Brazil, and in the whole Amazon region. So for the unity of Latin America, for the development of Latin America as a whole region, Colombia has always been a key player and a key place. Now, since last 5 or 6 years, or actually I should go back a little bit, since the end of the first decade of the century, we have seen the important U.S. influence through the execution of Plan Colombia. Now, Plan Colombia was originally designed under the Clinton administration as a plan to combat drug trafficking. That's the way it was portrayed, to combat drug trafficking and to put some sort of an end to the Colombian Civil War. It continually during all these years, the U.S. policy towards Colombia has eventually has been changing according to the enemy in turn. First, there was a fight against communism when it was an issue of the guerrilla warfare against FARC and ELN. But then it changed to drug trafficking and terrorism, and then whatever's the threat is at the time. Now, the important thing is that this Plan Colombia, signed in 1999, in a document that was originally written in English, and the Colombian president at the time, Andrés Pastrana, signed the document without reading it, obviously, because he did not speak English, and did not sign the translation of the document. It basically re-engineered the Colombian conflict and placed and opened the door for the United States to completely have a strong military presence in Colombia. Now, when I say this, you have to think that Colombia has seven U.S. bases on its territory, but the agreement also allows Colombia's military bases to be open to U.S. presence. So when we say that in the region, in the whole South American, Latin American region, the United States has 70 bases in total, we're not even counting the fact that they have all of the Colombian bases, because they have access to all of the Colombian bases. And they also have, and something that's very important too, that this agreement allows not only for them to be at these bases, but they are granted immunity. The U.S. military forces are granted immunity so that anything that they are accused of doing in these bases or around they're not going to be able to be processed by local authorities, nor being taken up to the International Court of Justice. Now, this is very important because when you see during the last decades or so, the number of reports of sexual trafficking, of sexual abuse that has been taking place around U.S. bases, something that, by the way, we all know is not exclusive of Colombia, but we have many reports of places such as Japan and Vietnam and other places of the sort. Well, all of these accusations that can be brought up, or that have been brought up against U.S. troops, are completely ignored because Plan Colombia gives them the coverage and the immunity to do this. Now, I know that we're not speaking specifically about NATO actions in Colombia, but it is important that you understand what the connection and the power that being a global partner gives the Colombian military and gives the United States in this case. After the since the reactivation of the Fourth Fleet in 2018, the Southern Command now has taken operations in the Caribbean and in the Pacific, many of them claiming to be operations against drug trafficking, but threatening, of course, a country like Venezuela. There have been many instances where airplanes have crossed into our space of monitoring, space, the airspace we monitor, trying to collect intelligence or doing other things. And also ships have been near our waters, and we understand this as a sort of intimidation threat against Venezuela. But this means that there's a possibility of military operations both in Colombia and from Colombia, as well as added allies in the region, such as in Puerto Rico, which of course is is under U.S. Colonization and is the starting point of any invasion in Central America, as has been historically, but also because there's presence in the Caribbean of other European and NATO members, like French, British, and Dutch colonies also are present still in the area. This for us, again, as we have been the target of U.S. aggression in different type of strategies in a hybrid war that includes sanctions, that includes diplomatic attacks, that includes the stealing of Venezuelan resources, that includes the recognition of an unelected parallel government. This is a threat, or we feel that this is a threat that is part of that might be a combined strategy between the U.S. Foreign policy and its NATO allies. To close, I just wanted to mention a couple of things that I think are important. That this is not a statement that we make lightly. During the last, during the pandemic in the year 2020, we have seen the intent of mercenaries to come into Venezuela to provoke violence and to work towards the overthrow of President Nicolas Maduro. Now, this is important because these mercenaries were trained in Colombia. So when we see that there's this close relationship, this very tight relationship between Colombia and the United States, where they have presence in the bases, where they have been training and providing weapons, where now, because of this agreement as a NATO, a global partner, they become the first in line in option of purchasing weapons from the United States. When we see that they're using the weapons that the U.S. military is discarding, and when they buy new technology, then they discard the weapons and they're taken to Colombia. And I don't say that the training of mercenaries is not something that we can take lightly. If we remember that just about a year ago, the president of Haiti was murdered in Haiti by Colombian mercenaries. When we have seen Colombian mercenaries, this is by the way the first time in Latin American history that we have had a president executed by mercenaries from another country, and that we openly have known about this. When you know the presence of Colombian mercenaries in Yemen, something as far away as Yemen, you see that that what Colombia can become, or has been becoming, because of this hostile government of Duque, is basically a hub for mercenaries, paramilitarism, and a threat to the stability of the region in Latin America. We in 2014, under CELAC, and I'll close with this, 2014 with CELAC, the organization that groups most or all of Latin America and the Caribbean without the United States and Canada, we declared that our zone is a zone of peace. And we have made this an important declaration when we continue to strive to make sure that no conflicts are brought over to our region. So it is of great concern what NATO expansionism can do, not only what it's doing today currently in Europe, but the possibilities that it can expand its conflicts here in our region. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carlos. This is really great. So informed and also providing a perspective from another part of the world. Our next speaker is from yet another part of the world. Professor Li Qinshi has been teaching at the School of International Studies at Renmin University in China. He became lecturer there in 1993, associate professor in 2002, and professor in 2009. Between 1994 and 1995, he went to the University of Kent for advanced studies in the UK. And from 1998 to 1999, he gave lectures at the Institute for International Relations at the University of Denver in the United States. He also at the time, later on participated in the US Congress as China with a Fulbright project fund. He was the first person in the research project who worked for a year in the office of a US congressman. During this period, in September 2004, he was invited to participate in all the activities of the China Observation Mission in the Washington area and of the US election delegation, and gain a deeper understanding of the US political system. So, Professor Li, the floor is yours. Professor Li. Are you there, Professor Li? Carlos, can you please check? Carlos Martinez, can you please check if he's there?
Yeah, so Radhika, he's in the Zoom room, but I've been WeChatting with him and he's having some difficulties with his audio. He was going to leave the meeting and enter again, but I think in the meantime, we might have to take another speaker.
Okay, well, in that case, perhaps Jenny, may I call on you to go next? Are you okay with that? Jenny Clegg? Okay, great. Let me then quickly introduce Jenny Clegg, who is kindly consented to go now. Jenny is an independent writer and researcher. She's former senior lecturer at the international studies and a long-time China specialist. She's the author of China's Global Strategy Towards a Multipolar World, and she is also an activist in the peace and anti-war movements in the United Kingdom. So Jenny, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Radhika, and I'm very pleased to be able to join this discussion today. I just start out by saying NATO is the nuclear armed fortress that helps to elevate the West above the rest, and it anchors Europe to the West, severing it from its Eurasian geography. But NATO members are also Pacific powers, the US, Canada, and France and Britain, which maintain possession of a few islands and some considerable Pacific maritime territory. And it's the Pacific, the makings of an Asian NATO, and also conversely, the Eurasian dimensions that I want to discuss. Today, the world focuses on Russia and the Ukraine, but for the US, China is the competitor. And as I see it, the Ukraine crisis is the first phase in the US's last-ditch battle to retain its world supremacy. A battle pitting democracies, so-called democracies, against autocracies, in which NATO is to serve as the armed vanguard against the so-called Russia-China alliance. So the world before NATO was to be the new world of the UN Charter, which, in the coordination of the wartime allies, the US, UK, Soviet Union, and China, and in its commitment to national sovereignty, held the promise of a multipolar world. And it was this new world of the equality of nations that the US set out to smash in the First Cold War. The Cold War in the Pacific divided China and Korea and involved, of course, two hot wars in Korea and Vietnam at the cost of countless lives, countless war crimes. The US wanted to set up an Asian NATO. However, Australia lacked trust in Japan after World War II. Japan's military was constrained under Article 9 of its constitution, and many Southeast Asian states, having fought to gain independence, chose non-alignment over subordination in a military alliance. In 1955, SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, was set up to block the communist, so-called communist domino effect, but it lacked unity and folded in 1997. The US instead has had to rely on bilateral alliances and a spread of some 400 military bases to encircle China. So the Cold War never ended in the Pacific. China and Korea remained divided. Nevertheless, there was a degree of thaw in the 1990s, which allowed China to improve its relations in the region, whilst ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, extended membership to the Indo-Chinese nations. Regional economic growth entered a new phase. But then things started to go into reverse. Obama embarked on his Asian pivot, launching the freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. Trump followed, declaring China a strategic competitor, and initiated a Quad, drawing India into a new network with Australia, Japan, and the US. Then in 2020, the counter trend gathered momentum with agreement on RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership for East Asia. The EU too was about to sign a major investment deal with China. These developments together recalling the coalition of Germany all the way across to Japan that Brzezinski warned about in 1997, and he saw it as being hostile to the US. So after 2020, the US prepared to strike back, and in September 2021 came AUKUS, a mini Asian NATO, an intervention by the outside Anglosphere, sowing disunity within the region's resolve for Asians to deal with Asian affairs. Now, NATO, in fact, has been expanding into Asia since 2012 with its Partnerships for Peace program, which has been mentioned before, drawing in Australia, Japan, New Zealand, Pakistan, and the Philippines. And in 2014, NATO was drawing an equation already between Russia and the Ukraine and China and the South China Sea. At the 2019 NATO summit, Pompeo raised the issue of the China threat, and in 2021, NATO's 2030 forecast adopted an Indo-Pacific strategy, which made it very clear: Russia first, then China. Building on Trump's anti-China approach, Biden has further elevated the Quad and focused more on Taiwan, but the Quad lacks military muscle, hence the announcement of AUKUS. Under AUKUS, the US and UK are to equip Australia with nuclear-powered submarines, not only violating the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but also subverting the nuclear weapons-free zones of Southeast Asia and South Pacific, both important advances in regional independence in the 1980s. The purpose of these submarines is to extend Australia's naval reach much further into the South and East China Seas. Australia is to be transformed into a forward base for the US military, providing the core of a regional hybrid warfare network with looser regional links covering diplomacy, intelligence sharing, media narratives, supply chains, and so on. But the pact also represents a new level of cooperation in military technologies, in quantum computing, digital technologies, and we've seen a recent announcement of the development of hypersonic weaponry. AUKUS then is designed to secure US dominance over East Asia's future growth, not only by promoting arms sales, but also supporting US competition at the cutting edge of new technologies. Amidst the Ukraine crisis, as Radhika mentioned before, fears have been raised of a Chinese military takeover of Taiwan. This is a completely false parallel because the Ukraine is a sovereign state, whereas Taiwan is recognized by the UN as a part of China. But as in Europe, we're seeing militarization in East Asia accelerating. Japan has just increased its military budget by $50 billion. Australia has estimated the cost of AUKUS at an eye-watering $250 billion. Now, with the newly elected Conservative Prime Minister in South Korea, a Northeast Asian arc with Japan and the US comes into view. And with both Japan and South Korea strengthening military links with Australia, there are possible ties here into AUKUS in the South. AUKUS not only received a lukewarm reception amongst regional powers, with Indonesia and Malaysia most openly expressing their reservations. But again, as in Europe, pressure is being brought to bear to clear the obstacles to militarization, to erode the long-held stabilizing positions of Japan's peace clause, as well as ASEAN's non-aligned instincts, using sanctions here to splinter and subordinate the organization. The real parallel is not Ukraine-Taiwan, but Ukraine and the South China Sea. Whilst Russia insists on Ukraine's neutrality, China has been seeking the neutrality of the South China Sea in negotiations on a code of conduct which limits permission for outside powers to set up naval bases. The US has made the so-called democratic right of any country to choose its allies the marker in the Cold War battle line of so-called democracies versus autocracies. And here also lies the meaning of the free and open Indo-Pacific. That is the freedom to join in the making of an Asian NATO. Why is it that the US is blocking the peace negotiations on Ukraine's neutrality? Why can't it accept the legitimacy of Russia's security concerns? Because that would set a precedent for China over Taiwan and the South China Sea. And it is China that is the real challenger. Now, amidst false allegations that China is supplying arms to Russia and propping Russia up, NATO is strengthening its links with the so-called Pacific Four: Australia, Japan, South Korea, and New Zealand. And the upcoming NATO summit this June will see an attempt to legitimize NATO's increasing penetration into the Indo-Pacific as a necessity to thwart the so-called Russia-China alliance. Finally, NATO's expansion is the root cause of the war in Europe. It's equally endeavoring to divide and destabilize East Asia, a region now forecast to overtake Europe as the center of the world economy in 2013. Russia first, China next. NATO is bringing a new world order. It's called the jungle. If China hasn't criticized Russia, this is because it looks to the long term, to a new security plan, not just for Europe, but one which restores Europe's Eurasian orientation. In other words, a new Eurasian security order. China is taking its stand on the indivisibility of security, on security for all, not of one at the expense of another, and in this way is keeping alive the spirit of the UN Charter. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny. That was absolutely fantastic. I love this line about the jungle. I'm going to use it, but of course, attribute it to you. Absolutely correct and accurate. Our next speaker will be Professor Qinshi Li, who I introduced earlier. I think he's back in. So I just introduce him again very briefly. Professor Li is professor at the School of International Studies, Renmin University, where he teaches US politics and foreign policy, China-US relations, and Chinese foreign policy. And he has also worked as Congressional Fellow on Capitol Hill and has published extensively. So Professor Li, the floor is yours. I hope you're here now and can hear you, can hear everyone, and wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Desai. I'm so sorry to waste a lot of time. It's very unpredictable for some technical problems. I tried several devices and eventually made it. Okay. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. I think it's the high time to organize such a discussion meeting to share views with each other. And I'm talking on why should NATO be dissolved right now. This is something I want to share. Since I got the invitation very late, only 2 days ago, I only speak from my general understanding as a Chinese scholar, as what I understand, and for most of the Chinese would have the similar kind of understanding. So let me try to share with you. First, I think NATO is harming both regional and global peace and stability. I will list my views. First, needless to say, NATO has played the role of keeping the balance between the Union and the United States, the two blocs during the Cold War time, and have protected the EU countries, European countries. That's the history. As Cold War relics, Cold War, organization is rival. Warsaw Pact had already disbanded in 1991, July 1st, just as the Indian Communist Party General Secretary appealed to dissolve NATO. So there's no use for NATO to continue to develop and expand. That's the first point about the history. And secondly, since 1991, NATO has expanded 5 rounds. I'm sorry, I didn't listen to the previous speakers. I would have to stick to what I have thought. That further is intensified, the Russians uneasiness, insecurity, caused the Russians, retaliation, worsened Russia-European relations, and worsened the European environment, security environment. Provided the Russians, excuses to retaliate by armed forces and even maybe expand its military expenditure the following years. Thirdly, even the NATO is not determined to dissolve. And NATO's functions should be transformed into something non-militarized, as it indicated, as the world expected to transform into a kind of law politics functions, such as protect humanitarian disaster, counter all kinds of cross-border crimes, such as terrorist attack and etc. And the fourth, contrast to the world widespread expectations, NATO does not disband. Neither has it transformed into non-military organization, but actively got involved in, regional issues all of NATO area. Military involvements, just like Afghanistan war, Iraq war, Libya, and Syria. And NATO's highly involved military operations in outside of NATO areas brought disasters to those relevant countries and regions, and the aftermath can hardly disappear for many years. Fifth, more ambitious, more aggressive is that NATO expanded to try to create a kind of so-called small Asia NATO in Asia. Try to make NATO Asianized. Plus, Professor just now mentioned the code on AUKUS. Its purpose is to try to align NATO members with the American Asian allies to form a kind of complete complement in segment against China and Russia. This is almost the last step to finish the mission right now. So the US supported, encouraged NATO ambition to contain China and Russia. It's definitely a kind of effort to repeat the Cold War. It's definitely against the, the trend of the world peace and the development. And the next, the US and NATO in Ukraine helped develop neo-Nazism. It was really horrible. Evidence disclosed one after another. It's definitely anti-human, very cruel. It's something that the Second World War, the winners like the US and the Soviet Union together with China has helped defeat it. Those Ukraine Nazi organizations have slaughtered dozens of thousands of Ukraine people, regardless they are Russian, national, or Ukraine. And what's more horrible, so many evil operations in underground factories to torture children. It's hard. It's really beyond my description. After I taught my students, none of them would believe in this. But we know such kind of wrongdoing will eventually backfire. Even today, the Ukrainians could kill themselves, their own people. Maybe in the future, both the US and NATO would also suffer backfire. We will see about that. And then lastly, I think there are widespread rumors right now about the so-called Grand Reset. Very, very horrible, ambitious, and evil plan to reduce the human, the population, the worldwide population anywhere, no matter the east or west. It's really very horrible, and I think Russia, Ukraine, the war, stimulated by the US and NATO is part of that ambition, part of that plan. So this is the reasons I listed, and Next, I will focus on the the damages, impacts of expanded NATO. First, it will kidnap Europe. Europeans are rather, harmed than protected by the US, actually. That's to say, Europeans believe that they were protected by the Americans through NATO, but actually they were also harmed by such kind of arrangement. Even after they decided to expand their military expenditure, they can only intensify the American positions, influences through the NATO, not at all, strengthen their independent defense and foreign policy. So that's the first point. Secondly, NATO would be a kind of tool to split Russian and European relations after not too accomplished. Biden administration stepped in to create the problem for Russian and Ukraine relations. So everybody understands it's very close, between the two events. So I hope that the Europeans understand. They are really kidnapped. They seem to have the common defense with the US against the assumed Russian threat, but actually they also suffered from such kind of effort. And thirdly, 20 years after the Cold War experience demonstrated that no matter it's Afghanistan war or Iraq war or Syria war, the US and NATO try to resolve international conflicts through military means. It is wrong. It cannot resolve any problems, and it can only bring more problems for the conflicts. I think enough lessons for the world, even for the American people. And I think Afghanistan war is definitely a good case. Who paid the price? Yeah, yes. And okay. Lastly, I hope, as the Chinese always emphasize, 100 years of great change is accelerating because of pandemic and economic problems. Anyway, we realize, I think the American proposed, solutions to conflicts such as Russia, Ukraine, is not workable. We have to rely on peaceful means, negotiations. Big countries like the US and China should sit together with Russia and European countries, together with India, to prepare for peace solutions. We shouldn't compete for armed competitions. And I hope through our dialogue, the conference, we can try to exert the influence on the decision makers in the US, in Russia, Europe. Hopefully we could try to bring the conflicts as quickly as possible through peaceful means. Thank you so much. Sorry for the time.
Not at all. That was really great. Thank you. And we are looking forward to the question and answer, because you made a lot of really important points, and I'm sure there will be questions. Okay, I do believe that Mr. M.K. Bhadrakumar has not been able to join us. So I'm going to go now to Abayomi Azikiwe. That he will be our next speaker. He's the editor of Pan-African Newswire and a graduate of Wayne State University in Detroit in political economy as well as organizational and administrative studies. Azikiwe has worked for several decades in solidarity with various liberation movements and progressive governments in Africa, the Caribbean, and in other parts of the world. He also serves as political analyst for various satellite television networks and press agencies internationally. So Abayomi, please go ahead.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Desai. I want to also thank the the International Manifesto Group for this invitation. This is the second time I've been able to present over this medium. I would like to speak on three different important topics related to our case against NATO. I want to talk about the historical legacy of the Cold War that still remains with us today in the 21st century. I also want to touch on some of the military strategies that were used during the height of the Cold War against national liberation movements and socialist-oriented governments in Africa and Asia and Latin America, and also to touch on some of the emerging characteristics of imperialism in the 21st century. While the Pentagon and the United States State Department continues to provide a distorted rationale for the instigation of a major military conflict in Eastern Europe, billions of dollars are being utilized to transfer offensive weapons aimed at preventing a peaceful resolution to the current war in Ukraine. Now, although the corporate and government-controlled media outlets in Western Europe and in North America have reported to the public on a daily basis that their own administrations cannot be blamed for the current war in Ukraine, for any serious observer, the culpability for the tensions now in existence on an international level can be traced back to the desire by imperialism to expand the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO was formed in 1949 in the aftermath of the Second World War, and the initiation of the Cold War by Washington against the rising socialist and national liberation movements around the world. In 1949, only two countries on the African continent were considered independent. That was Ethiopia and Liberia. Both of these countries in 1949 were highly compromised due to the intervention of the United States and Britain in their internal affairs, stemming from the legacy of African enslavement and the rise of imperialist fascism during the 1920s and 1930s, initially in Italy and later in Germany. The founding members of NATO were all in North America and Western Europe. They were Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, and of course the United Kingdom and the United States. Many of these states were involved in the Atlantic slave trade and colonialism. All of them benefited from the super exploitation of African and other oppressed peoples after the transformation of the world economic system, which began during the 15th century. The outcome of the World War I and World War II left the US as the dominant imperialist power in the world. The only real effective challenge to the hegemony of the United States and its allies during the post-World War II period were the socialist states of the USSR, the People's Republic of China, which was founded in 1949 after more than 2 decades of armed struggle, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which was consolidated in 1948, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the north, which declared independence in August of 1945, along with other anti-capitalist, anti-colonial, anti-neo-colonial movements, which arose in Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and Latin America, which were objectively bolstered by burgeoning African-American and worker struggles in the United States, which developed during the late 1940s and 1950s. The position of the United States during the 1950s and 1960s represented the height of political hypocrisy. African Americans were being denied fundamental civil rights protections, which were originally put in place during the period after the Civil War of 1861 to 1865. There were civil rights acts and amendments to the US Constitution as early as 1866 in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. These measures were ostensibly designed to reconstruct some semblance of democratic governance. Nonetheless, the Reconstruction process was overthrown during the latter decades of the 19th century, which placed African Americans in the social position of neo-slavery at worst and second-class citizenship at best. Participants in the leading civil rights organizations after World War II were pressured to denounce the socialist camp and to pledge allegiance to United States imperialism as the only legitimate system of governance, not only domestically, but also internationally. Those leading activists and public figures who refused to adopt the Cold War policies of Washington were subjected to investigations, prosecution, imprisonment, economic isolation, and exile. All the while, African Americans were being lynched by mobs, killed without justification by police, executed by the state, and denied fundamental due process and equal protection under the law. In 1949, of course, there was the Paris Peace Conference, and several leading African-American leftists attended, people such as Paul Robeson, Dr. W.B. Du Bois, Shirley Graham Du Bois. All of them were subjected to persecution in the aftermath of their attendance at this conference in 1949. In 1950, they had their passports seized. Some were prosecuted or attempted to be convicted for espionage, people such as W.B. Du Bois. Paul Robeson, of course, had his passport seized, isolated from being able to earn a living as an artist in the United States. And people like Alpheus Hunton, W. Alpheus Hunton, who was a co-founder of the Council on African Affairs, was, of course, put in prison for a period of time due to his activism. Now, I'd like to go on very quickly to talk about some of the repressive actions that were taken prior to the formation of NATO in the immediate aftermath of World War II. Now, two examples of repression and mass killings by countries in the aftermath of World War II were carried out in the French-controlled North African state of Algeria and the British-controlled Gold Coast, which was later known as Ghana after independence in 1957. Now, these acts by the colonial powers were designed to preserve imperialist rule in Africa. Both Britain and France were founding members of NATO. In Algeria, on the same day that the Nazi German government surrendered on May 8th of 1945, there was a huge massacre that began in Algeria due to the fact that people went out into the streets not only to celebrate the defeat of Germany, but also to call for Algerian independence. Now, this was on May 8th of 1945. Thousands rallied in Sétif and as Allied powers, including colonial rulers of France, marked a hard-won victory in Europe over Nazi Germany. The people chanted, "Long live the Allied victory." Of course, the French opened fire on these crowds, which led to further violence that resulted in the deaths of thousands of people. About a decade later, in 1954, the Front National Liberation, the FLN, was formed. They embarked upon an 8-year revolutionary armed struggle and diplomatic struggle to win independence in Algeria. And of course, this year represents the 60th anniversary of the independence of Algeria. Also on the Gold Coast, in 1948, on February the 28th, African veterans of war who coalesced with traditional leaders to demand better conditions under British colonialism. The veterans from the Gold Coast wanted benefits for their service during the war, and traditional leaders wanted a reduction in prices for goods that were controlled by the British colonial authorities. The same or similar response that was carried out in Algeria in 1945 was also carried out in the Gold Coast in 1948, of course, leading to splits within the United Gold Coast Convention, the formation of the Convention People's Party by Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, and then, of course, the liberation of Ghana in 1957. So the founding members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization were very much steeped in the legacy of African enslavement, of colonization, and also military repression against the independence movements. In closing, I'd just like to touch on, and perhaps we can get more deeply into this during the question and answer period, the modern impact of imperialism and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. We can discuss the destruction of Libya some 11 years ago when NATO embarked upon a 7-month bombing campaign that destroyed the entire infrastructure of the country, killed anywhere between 50,000 and 100,000 people who were Libyans and people living in Libya. They created a tremendous economic depression. Today, Libya is a center for human trafficking and internecine conflict. They have still not been able to install a stable government there after some 11 years of imperialist NATO intervention. And finally, the economic impact of NATO's policy has been disastrous for working people in the United States, in Britain, in Western Europe, and moreover, in West Asia and in Africa, because both Russia and Ukraine are considered major players in agricultural production. And due to the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia, due to the failure of the United States to prevent a war in Ukraine, there's going to be a serious problem with food deficits in Africa and West Asia and other parts of the world. We already see here in the United States the rapid rise in fuel prices and food prices, the cost of transportation. We see as well the rise in rents and services here in the United States. The fact that the minimum wage has not been raised in the United States in many, many years magnifies the problem. Also coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been an inflationary spiral that has been initiated in the United States. I'll end right there, and perhaps we can take these issues up further during the question and answer period. Thank you once again for the invitation. It's such an honor to be on a panel with all these comrades from People's Republic of China, from Canada, from South Africa, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and so forth. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Abayomi. And our final speaker, we will get to question and answer very soon, because our final speaker is last but very, very far from least, Chris Matalco. He is the full-time Second Deputy General Secretary of the South African Communist Party, the General Secretary of the Friends of Cuba Society, and a member of the South African Peace Initiative. Chris, please go ahead.
No, thank you very much, Comrade Radhika, and also I'm very glad to be a part of this platform and to exchange ideas, but also to begin to contribute towards a platform that can see us do important joint activities, mobilization, and other things that can get us moving forward with these matters. In fact, what we will try and do is just to flag a few things, because I think the majority of the speakers that spoke before us, and also thank you for your contributions you've made. You have laid a very important foundation to, just to plug a few points that we think we must flag. The ongoing Russia's military incursion in the Ukraine has solicited, in our estimation, varying interpretations of views across the globe. And a lot of effort has been put into seeking to formulate a particular narrative in support of the United States and NATO positions in this regard. We want to argue that the goal for genuine, enduring peace must not be sacrificed at the altar of the falsification of history and geography. In fact, Africa's positions have been soiled and presented, among other things, as a nostalgia for the Soviet Union's support for national liberation struggles, and that this is the primary reasons why we support Russia in this regard, and have been posited as why a group of African countries not supporting the United Nations resolution was disproportionately high in this forum. However, there is a common thread running through all of these presentations. Russia's struggle in the Ukraine is proving to be, in our estimation, a proxy war of NATO against Russia. This is also true for interpretations and positions of most of the African continent states, and they are voting on the matter in the United Nations Forum. Almost all of the so-called think tanks, institutes, and others on the continent who are wholly funded by the European Union, the Open Society Foundation, the National Endowment for Democracy, the Democracy Fund, the governments of the US and Europe, have embarked on a disinformation campaign seeking to portray Russia as harboring Cold War and Soviet-era ambitions and sentiments, including in how it relates to the African continent. Russia's growing influence, we want to argue, does not only rely on its historic ties and relations between some countries on the continent and their relationship with the former Soviet Union. Russia, it must be remembered, has over the years sought to cultivate deeper ties and relations with the African continent. In fact, in 2019, the first Russia-Africa summit was held in Sochi, where various agreements were entered into, leading to the deepening trade and other relations, including expanding arms trade. This, among other things, also coincided with the changing geopolitical dynamics across the globe. BRICS, among other things, also brings together Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and later on incorporated South Africa, shares common perspectives of multipolarity and the promotion of inclusive, equitable, and representative multipolar international system with the United Nations at its center, based on international law and purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter. And this resonates, we want to argue, with many across the globe, and these struggles and the struggles that are waging for a better world for all. In fact, BRICS is an important plank for the ongoing activization and mobilization of the non-aligned movement around its founding ideals. We've also been told, among other things, that the Ukraine has withdrawn from an important continental peacekeeping force from the United Nations Organization Stabilization Mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in MONUSCO, to defend their homeland. Accordingly, this move, according to the mainstream outlets, symbolizes wider implications and concerns of Europe and how Europe will treat Africa as it confronts the growing threat from Russia as it started on the 24th of February. However, we want to argue that not much is said and insisted upon of the sovereignty and dignity from the insidious role of the former colonizer, the interventionist US imperialism and militaristic consequences of NATO and AFRICOM, which over the past years, lasting the entire period of the independence of the continent, has never contributed to anything other than instability, war, devastation, misery, poverty, and indignity to the vast majority of the people of the continent. In fact, the resultant migrations to Europe and elsewhere, and the unnecessary deaths occurring in the process of crossing the Mediterranean seas, should be put squarely at the door of the United Nations, the EU, and NATO. Even after contributing in large part to the overthrow and the breakup of Libya, as it has been mentioned earlier on, towards the devastation and the bloody death of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, the RAND Corporation, which is an important federal government funded research and development center, continues to assert that the increasing prominence of NATO's Mediterranean initiatives suggest greater degree of unity and coherence that actually exists. Close quote. Today, Libya is a wrecked country at war with itself because those who sought to increase their profits realize their goals and their interests are still intact. The weaponization of international relations has been in the making and is increasing its intensity since the imminent rise of China and other blocks of trade economic concentrations, which are outside of the orbit of influence of the United States and has unleashed acute militarism and hybrid wars on the US and across the globe for dominance and hegemony, as we have heard from even Latin America. Carlos Ron explicitly told us about that influence in Latin America and elsewhere. The Europe's conjunctural relations with the continent remain in the main in the realm of migration and security. This is also amplified by Boris Johnson's recent ranting, his proposals for dealing with the migration matter and suggesting there's an agreement between themselves and Rwanda. We think this further compounds and dilutes the problem of dealing with the objective question of racism and the consequences that have created migration. Migrants who in the main happen to be poor, non-European, will be further humiliated as they are sent to Rwanda. This implies the UK, among other things, is determined not only to approach the matter through its racist prism, but also refuse to accept the responsibility in this regard. As part of a signatory of many other conventions, United Nations units and other things. Today, we stand at the crossroads. Indeed, leading developing imperialist nations are seeking to lead others into a new Cold War. In the main, against the People's Republic of China, the Russian Federation, and the evolving alternative societies across the world. And we need to counter that. We must wage a concerted struggle to defend, deepen, and advance our agenda. An alternative world is possible and necessary. Thank you very much, Comrade Radica.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was a resounding end to the formal presentations. And as you can see from the chat, people have already, there's been a lively discussion in the chat already, and I hope to bring it in here because people have pointed out many interesting things about the course of the military conflict, about, of course, the speakers have presented very important facts about the imperial background of NATO. And it's interesting, if you look at a map of the countries that are participating in sanctions, you can see that for all the talk of globalization and American hegemony, the people who are doing this have shrunk to the core of the imperial world. That is really quite interesting. And the vast majority of the world does not agree. So I hope to talk about that. I hope to talk about how to bring about peace. And I hope also to talk about how Western actions are in so many ways boomeranging. But before we do all that, can I please have Alan Freeman, if you are ready, to make a brief intervention on behalf of the International Manifesto Group? No, we cannot hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
So thank you everybody who's taken part in this wonderful event. And I want to say two things. One, it's clear we are at a turning point in world history. We are already discussing our next webinar, which is going to be organized by Brandon Love, which is asking why attitudes amongst those who count themselves socialists have been so mixed and ambiguous as regards the causes of this war. And that parallels what we call a 1914 moment, a moment when the left divided because it did not clearly distinguish the need for international working class unity and the national interests of the countries they were represented in. And that made it very perilous. Let's recall 1914, the 1914-18 war was one of the most disastrous episodes in the history of humanity. If you look at the number of people who were killed and the destruction wrought, if we repeat that with nuclear weapons, it's doubtful who will live. And so we are doing whatever we can to make sure that that does not happen, and we're not alone. There is a growing band of alternative commentators and organizers for peace, and we are hoping to inform people so that you can take part in that. That means we need support. It means we have no corporate funders. We have no state funders. We do not accept advertising revenue. We have no large donors. We need you. We need your support. I'll give you a simple calculation. We think that in order to maintain the 3 sites which we manage and this YouTube channel, we need about $25,000 a year. If everybody who is listening to this broadcast were to give us a monthly donation of $10, that would cover it. If of the 4,000 people who are on our YouTube channel or the 8,000 people who receive our mails, $1 a month would be perfectly fine. That would be enough. I think given the stakes, I hope you will agree that that's worth it. So I want you to consider donating. And that doesn't mean we've had some wonderful one-off donations. So we're grateful for that. We need regular donations. So I want you to visit, if you can, the donate page, which I'm going to put in the chat, of the geopolitical economy site. And at the YouTube channel, you'll find it's possible also to donate via Patreon. So you've got 3 ways. You can visit the donation site, and you can either donate using PayPal or using a credit card. You do have a choice. That's now working for those who've had trouble with that. Or you can go to our YouTube channel, just look underneath any of the videos and you'll see there is a link to the Patreon site. So thank you very much. And we look forward to being able to work with you into a new world free of all these fears.
Thank you very much, Alan. Okay, so now we would like to open up for questions and answers. I would like to request everybody who has questions to please raise your hand using the raise hand function. Can I please request questions? In the meantime, while we are waiting for people to think about their questions, let me put one to all the panelists. One of the things that really interests me a great deal is while of course I entirely agree that NATO is imperialist, NATO is militarist, NATO is warlike, there are also very critical ways in which NATO's purposes are not being served. NATO is aiming for things that it cannot have. So what do you consider to be some of the major ways in which NATO's efforts in the present conflict are failing, and also in the projected conflicts with China, etc., can be expected to fail? So in any order whatsoever, if the speakers would like to intervene on this matter. Anyone? Yes, go ahead, Abayomi, please go ahead.
Well, first of all, which has been brought up, the fact that in the initial resolution that was put forward before the United Nations General Assembly, various African countries either did not vote or abstained from the vote. Eritrea voted categorically against the condemnation of Russia. Then, of course, the most recent resolution had even less support among African countries. Even if governments, for example, on the African continent, there have been some governments initially that spoke out against the Russian special military operation in Ukraine. The people in those countries, many of whom do not support the United States or NATO position in regard to the war. So they have not been able to win over many governments in Africa, Asia, and Latin America and the Caribbean to any semblance of enthusiastic support for this conflict. And as I tried to touch on, the devastating social and economic impact of this conflict is before us now. And of course, it will worsen because of the COVID-19 pandemic. There are very problematic structural deficiencies in the Western capitalist countries. Go into the stores, try to seek repairs on one's homes or automobiles, and you're faced with extreme shortages and other difficulties. So I believe that it is not succeeding in that particular regard, although many people are dying on a daily basis. But the way in which the corporate media in the United States and also the BBC and other outlets in Western Europe have covered this situation, they have attempted to block out any criticism, even among elements in the peace movement, for example, in the West, who take the position that both sides are wrong. Now, that's not my view of the situation, but even those who say NATO is not correct, Russia is not correct. They won't even allow those perspectives onto the so-called liberal networks like MSNBC in the United States, CNN in the United States, which of course are promoting more conflict, advocating that a no-fly zone be established over Ukraine, which of course would develop into a full-blown conventional military conflict between NATO and the Russian Federation. And there's so many other issues that they refuse to deal with over the corporate and even government control media outlets. So this is going to be a problem because if you look back at Vietnam, for example, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which turned out to be a complete fabrication. We could talk about the intervention in the Dominican Republic in 1965 under the guise of preventing a communist government from taking power. The support by NATO and the United States of colonial regimes, for example, in Portugal, against the revolutionaries in Guinea-Bissau, Angola, Mozambique, not to mention what happened in South Africa in regard to the ANC, SWAPO in Namibia, ZANU-PF, ZAPU, and they have always been on the wrong side of the progressive movement throughout the world. People have to understand, and they have to look at this from a very skeptical standpoint, that they were lying then and they're lying again today in regard to the source of the conflict in Ukraine and its potential, as speakers pointed out, potential for a full-blown nuclear confrontation between NATO and the Russian Federation. So I don't think it will succeed in that regard, but the destruction that is being carried out by the NATO countries led by the United States is having a devastating impact on the majority of people throughout the world.
Thanks. Any other speakers would like to intervene on this question before I go to some of the questions? Okay, maybe I will hand over to Nebojša Milikić. I hope I've said that reasonably okay.
Yeah, it was very nice. Thank you. Thank you for this great analysis and these great perspectives. I'm from Serbia, from the Western Balkans. The country's leadership, at least, is playing some game of neutrality in this tragedy in Ukraine. And this gives at least a little bit of diversity in the information sphere. But anyway, we are caught in a global network of confusion, and it's really hard to stand it. Okay, I won't play a devil's advocate here. This is why I posted a link to my text about event in one small city in Romania, just to illustrate how NATO in the newly, to say, acquired countries influences entire society. I mean, institutional sphere, police, media, everything gets paralyzed, gets oriented towards, let's call it understanding of demands of that structure. It was about the death of a young girl that was probably drawn into some sort of prostitution network. Maybe it doesn't have to do with NATO. There is a military NATO base in the place. It was not the first case. It was not only Americans. There are also other sides included. But the problem is that entire societal network of, let's say, organization and is simply subdued. It's submissive towards that mission of NATO expansion. So this is why I want to say, because I have to somehow complain, I mean, under quotation marks, because what we were talking about is results, this is symptoms. What I see as a problem with NATO, the problem that we have, NATO is, in one sentence, that is a stiffener of a global and local division of labor. This is what the NATO's role is. So there was a great incident, to say theoretical incident, maybe a month ago, when Rosa Luxemburg Foundation published a text in which somebody claimed that NATO, after the Putin's aggression, became a defensive alliance. So I mean, I'm an activist for years. It's not my personal response, but I agree. It is defensive alliance. It defends the right of central capitalist economies, ruling classes, including huge portion of middle class, to continue to exploit, to extract values for peripheries and semi-peripheries. This is what NATO is about. So it is not about some wicked, conspirational, militaristic lunatics, I mean, to parodize a bit. It is about necessity of that system. It is just there because, for example, like when it encroaches into new territories, first comes, let's say, nervous system, which is cultural hegemony, then comes skeleton, which is infrastructure and
can you wrap up? Yeah, the question.
Like economy, and in the end, what comes is a muscle. NATO is just a muscle that protects all this. So if we cannot think of a serious transformation of economic system globally and the interest of so many people worldwide, which are in the most powerful economies, culturally, industrially, etc., technologically, I mean, it won't. The result of all this situation will not change in itself. That was all, you know. So
thank you. No, that's. I think those are really important comments, and I think what you're doing is you're inviting all the speakers to reflect on and say something more about how do you get this wall-to-wall propaganda, this that we see in Western countries in particular. How is it organized, etc. I think that's sort of what you are asking. So yeah, sorry about that, but we should get to speakers and questions and so on. So who would like to respond? Yeah, who would like to respond to what Neboisa has said? Anyone? Jenny?
Well, yes, I don't know that I've got a lot to say on that. I mean, it is completely overwhelming, the mindset of the liberal mindset, and yeah, I just wonder as to how to kind of understand it and how to kind of enter into it in order to argue against it. And I think that you started out there perfectly rightly in saying that NATO is defending the interests, defending the interests of the Western ruling classes. And of course, the people in the West are identifying their interests with that. But I think that, on this, question of a kind of consciousness, that there is a bifurcation, and I think that that's what was Aboyama was talking about, and it seems that that since the NATO wars started on Afghanistan, 20 years ago, and then on Iraq, that that in the developing world has been on a completely different course, and has, after 20 years, is simply not appreciating the lectures that these former colonial powers are still giving out. They envisage their role as 19th century missionaries bringing progress and human advancement. And then after 20 years, what do we have in Afghanistan? Just ruin. And the way that the plight of the Ukrainians, and of course we sympathize with the plight of the Ukrainians, but if in the anti-war movement in the UK, if we talk about Yemen, for example, which is in a humanitarian crisis, we're just told, oh, that's whataboutery. You know, I mean, this is nonsense. And we have to untwist these arguments. But I think that there is something very fundamental at root here, that many people who are against the Iraq War, for example, in Britain, know perfectly well what the role of NATO has been. It's just that they think that the devil they know is better than the devil that they don't know, and that an intervention by Russia is worse than an intervention by liberal democracies. But very interestingly, I mean, I just think it's so interesting to see how people in Asia and Africa, and governments in Asia and Africa, are just saying, well, treat us with a bit of respect. You know, we don't appreciate it. We don't appreciate being told what to do. We're not going to be told. This time is over, when the the old colonials told other people what to do. And even Modi, the Prime Minister of India, avoided meeting Boris Johnson, and the ASEAN, the Southeast Asian countries, said to Biden or his representative, sorry, we're too busy to meet. And the next minute set up a meeting with China. So I think that I'm sort of swerving a bit into your question, Radhika, but we are being challenged, and so many of our assumptions are being challenged, and we need to rethink and how to make them meaningful in this new situation. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. Now I have 3 questions already, and I'm sort of formulating one of my own, but I will take the next 3, which I know are from Suzanne, Carlos, and Alan, and then we will have a round of answers, and then maybe we'll see if there's any more questions. Okay, Suzanne, please go ahead.
Thank you. We can all be proud to have among our speakers Kate Hudson of the British CND. I'd like to know what are the prospects for a broad action by the left to oppose NATO's role in fueling the war in Ukraine? Thank you.
That's excellent example of brevity and precision. Thank you, Suzanne. Carlos, please go ahead. And I should say, I'm sorry that Kate has had to leave, but I'm sure others will have lots of answers, including Jenny, who works with Kate in the peace movement, and Carlos for that matter. So, Carlos, please go ahead.
Thanks, Radhika. Yeah, I think all the speakers have done a really good job in terms of framing what's going on in Ukraine and this battle between NATO on the one hand and Russia and its allies on the other hand, in a global context, connecting the Atlantic and the Pacific. And I think they've built up a picture of what is essentially a global new Cold War and a military infrastructure of that global new Cold War, which includes NATO, it includes AUKUS, it includes the Quad. And you know, we're at a point in time where that global infrastructure and that new Cold War could strengthen, it could deepen, it could get, the other situation could get worse, or it could get better. You know, I think this is the principal dynamic of modern geopolitics. It's essentially continued imperialism versus a rising multipolarity. Now, and on that, you know, within that overall, you know, global worldwide framework, this crisis, the current crisis in Europe, is incredibly important and could be a turning point in either direction. And I just wanted to get the panelists' opinions on what are the best case scenario outcomes and what are the worst case scenario outcomes. You know, I think the best case scenario is pretty well known. It's essentially something along the lines of what Russia's demands have been for the last 8 years, i.e. that we want guarantees that Ukraine's going to be neutral, that NATO isn't going to expand any further, that we're not going to have a 2,000 kilometer border between NATO and Russia, and that the national rights of the people of the Donbass are going to be respected. And you know, that there'll be some form of autonomy or some reasonable solution to that problem. Now, the worst case scenario, you know, could potentially include a strengthening of NATO and a reversal of the trajectory of NATO becoming weaker and less popular and less relevant, but that it could, you know, now Sweden's talking about joining, Finland's talking about joining, you know, people in the public opinion in the West, it seems like there's more of a case for NATO, not against NATO. So I just like the panelists to potentially address some of those things. Thank you.
No, those are great questions, Carlos, and I'm just going to request the panelists to respond each in turn. So that's great. And I think, Alan, you had a question.
Well, two questions, to put it bluntly. There are two accusations that are made by people who resist the conclusions that are being shared here. One is the very common idea, particularly on the left, that Russia is an imperialist power and that China is an imperialist power. I think that's profoundly false, and it's based on a misunderstanding of what imperialism is, which is an economic relation of the rich nations to the poor nations, in which via the mechanisms of unequal exchange and economic subordination, the rich nations acquire the wealth that is generated by the labor of the poor nations. And in this, there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that Russia and China have been in the position of the subordinated, not the subordinators. China is recovering from that, but by going socialist. So that's my first question. My second question is on the nature of fascism, because I think there's a widespread charge that Russia, is essentially operating in a fascist manner, and an extraordinary denial of the prevalence of fascism in Ukraine. And I think that one of the things that is missing in the way that people attempt to refute the obvious evidence of massive influence of fascism within the way that the military operates and the state operates is that fascism is baked into the script. Once you say that we are going to build a nation on the basis of a language, you are already laying the ground for fascism. If you suppress the rights, the linguistic rights of 30% of the population who speak Russian and another 10% who speak other languages such as Romance, Transnistrian languages and so on, and you say, we are going to forcibly make you submit to our language, you cannot do it by any means other than fascist. Let's take a parallel. If Canada was today to decree that not only that nobody outside Quebec should speak French, but nobody inside Quebec should speak French, there would be no means other than most violent, forceful repression by which it could be enforced. Quebec would immediately attempt to break away. And this would be lauded by the left because they would say it's, legitimate. But when it comes to, there's a blind spot when it comes to what's happening in the republics. And that people forget that this war started as a civil war. So I think that we need a wide debate worldwide on the nature of what is imperialism and what is fascism.
Okay, I think great question. So I'm just going to go in roughly the order that I remember the speakers went in. And since Kate is not here, I'll go Jenny, Carlos, Professor Lee, Abayomi, and Chris in that order. So Jenny, would you like to respond to all these three questions, please? I can't hear you.
Sorry, I thought Carlos Ron went before me.
Okay, actually, you are right. In fact, since you did speak earlier, I will go, Carlos. I'll come last to you, Jenny, and go in the same order as I said. So, Carlos, please go ahead.
Okay, so many things to comment. But I would start by saying that I do agree that we have to look at this from the perspective of what NATO really represents today, and it is in fact that imperialist advanced unit that the sort of puts into question and puts into danger the whole multilateral system, the whole United Nations system. And we can argue about the effectiveness or not of the United Nations system, but I think it puts into question the principles under which the United Nations were founded, which is something that we must defend. I mean, the use of NATO to override the difficulties that they meet that imperialistic agenda may face in the Security Council in front of veto powers by Russia or China and in general terms dealing with the General Assembly, well, you just cut all that out by employing NATO. And we saw that, and we've seen this, since Afghanistan. We saw it in the invasion of Libya, which we often, leave out of the current discussion. But Libya was destroyed by NATO. And we don't talk about that in this current context, but we should. And then you see as this expansion of NATO with this idea of the global partners, and it's basically trying to take the organization everywhere else. It lost the area of the Atlantic. It has no borders anymore. And that's a very strong danger. And I agree that they started this by the cultural, by building on the cultural imagery. I mean, we know the Atlantic Council is funded by NATO, and one of the major think tanks in the United States that has a specific group that deals and analyzes and talks about Venezuela, for example, and where they have drawn many suggestions in defense of in defense of the puppet government or supposed government of Juan Guaido and so forth. So the discussion is not only on military terms that are very obviously seen when we talk about the military actions, but also on the level of influence that NATO can have through its other means, such as that the Atlantic Council. With regards to the best scenarios, worst scenarios, of course, I think Carlos gave the best scenario possible. I agree. It has to be, well, peace, of course, is always the best scenario, but it has to be a peace that is sustainable, because it's built on things that would avoid further conflict. So I understand. I believe I agree with Carlos' scenario. I think the worst is what we're seeing. The worst could be that in this new age we're entering, or in this new conflict, where you see a multipolar age trying to finally settle in. Well, the worst scenario was probably that NATO disrupts that process and sort of consolidates dominance of the West over this new multipolarity that we hope is built. And by the way, when I say that, and I think it's and this will take me to the other point that I think Alan was bringing up, if I remember correctly, on the issue of the left. Yes, I think this is an important moment in time. We're in a transition in a moment of transition where we see the multipolarity, the possibility of multipolarity being there with the growth of China and Russia, but also with the strengthening of regions such as Latin America and others. But multipolarity for what? And I think that's a real challenge for the left, as we must think that multipolarity is important, of course, to balance out and to slow down the imperialism that we have been undergoing in the last centuries. But we need to use that as a tool, not an end. That is not the end. The end is a more democratic, more popular movement, more strength, so that we can recover our resources in the planet, and that we can have societies that are different and respond to the real needs of the peoples, and that's going to take a lot of steps to getting there. The left needs to work on that strategy. The left needs to talk about the strategy, to discuss it, to find the minimum common ground, because we see in this particular conflict in Europe how there have been many positions. I don't think I've seen anything as divisive as this issue for the left in a long time. So I think the left needs to really look at the scenario and draw up a minimum plan on things we can agree with to move forward. And I think, and just to end, that to do that, we need to also talk about what Alan was saying. We need to talk about this fascism and this. We just had a meeting here in Caracas the last week on with different participants throughout the world on fascism, against fascism actually. And I think it's something that calls us to think if the right wing, extreme right is growing and is adopting fascist tactics and methods, well, how do we counter that? What do we need to do? How do we bring our values, and I say our, meaning ours as I, a socialist, and my government is a socialist government. How do we bring our values of humanity, of solidarity, of internationalism to confront these values, to give hope to people in those societies where neoliberal capitalism has overrun them, to the extent that they see no other choice or no other expectation rather than to turn into the fascist methods in order to provide for themselves. So these are discussions that we're still, that we really need to work on, and I think that's the way we should approach it.
Thanks so much, Carlos. Can I have Professor Lee next, if you would like to respond to all the three questions, and indeed anything else you saw in the chat and previous questions and so on. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I did miss a lot of very interesting speeches. I have to focus on what I have. A general response to the previous three speakers' questions, I find it very surprising what's going on in Ukraine after a 10 long years. 10 long years, we didn't know what was being there. Without the Russians' military operation, it is hard for the world to see the crimes, anti-human crimes. It is a real horrible situation. But we were totally, silenced. We didn't know. I think the American or the NATO narrative is so powerful to cover, to lie to the people. And actually the Chinese, highly influenced since the public opinions are very splitted over Russia, Ukraine, the military conflict right now. Some Chinese even fight against each other. They how to say, they split us too much. So we were misled. How can we change this? How can we teach the people, the world, to be careful about the wrongdoing, about the new fascism, Nazism, no matter it's in Ukraine or some other parts of the world. So I think the leftist forces worldwide should unite to voice strongly against this, but unfortunately it's very difficult since in China, as socialist country, our media is also manipulated by capitals of both the Chinese and Western. I myself are very upset about this. I feel so disappointed about the future. I feel danger, all kinds of danger. Because many Chinese, they didn't sense the danger. They don't know what's really going on. I think it seems we are really at the threshold of the Third World War of different kinds. We need to shut up, to weaken as possible as many people to face this. Okay, that's what I want to add. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'll go next to Abayomi. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you. In regard to the left's position on the Ukraine conflict, it is very divided. And of course, in the United States, It's largely been the result of the lack of mobilization to demand that the Biden administration changes its posture in regard to Ukraine. A lot of the problem has to do with the fact that Biden inherited the presidency from Donald Trump, who many people had turned against, who was a horrible president, and who, of course, stoked a lot of divisions within US society to the point where there was even an attempted coup to overturn the results of the elections during January of 2021. Many people voted for the Biden administration, but they did not vote for war. They voted for some type of social spending program, a lessening of international tensions, and also work towards some type of lessening of racial conflict and class conflict inside the United States. Of course, this has not happened since his presidency. He has, of course, failed to engineer the passage of key legislation that would enact reforms that would help millions and millions of working and oppressed people inside the United States. For example, the social spending bill, which would have provided long-term child tax credits, would have provided assistance for education, for housing, and so forth. That has failed, despite the fact that the majority of the lower house of the legislative apparatus, the House of Representatives, is dominated by the Democratic Party. The Senate is divided 50-50, but the vice president, which is the president of the Senate, can break ties. But as we've seen, there are elements within the Democratic Party itself, which is bitterly opposed to any type of social spending initiative on the part of the Biden administration, even in terms of environmental quality and so forth. So I think this is a major problem in the United States, the division of the left, the overwhelming influence of media propaganda, and even, I would even call it psychological warfare that's being waged against the majority of people inside the United States. The one-sided coverage of the Ukraine conflict, where, as I mentioned before, even those who take a position that both sides are wrong cannot even get their views aired over the corporate media networks and even national public radio. In terms of a resolution to the conflict, I believe very strongly that the US administration has to shift its position in order for it to be any type of peaceful resolution to this war. I saw a graphic in the Global Times out of China just recently. It was humorous, but very serious at the same time. It had an illustration of representatives from Ukraine and Russia holding negotiations in a room, and the United States, represented in caricature with the hat and the US jacket, standing outside listening in, saying that no, they should not reach a peaceful resolution to the conflict. And what the Biden administration has done by sending billions of dollars of offensive weapons into Ukraine, they're doing nothing except prolonging the conflict. And as the speaker from Serbia said earlier, they are defending, as far as they're concerned, they are defending their right to maintain a global hegemony over billions of people throughout the world. And I don't believe that's going to succeed. Many people will suffer. Many people will be displaced. We already have 82 million people around the world who are either refugees, internally displaced persons, and so forth. So I think NATO cannot prevail in this conflict if there's to be peace in Eastern Europe and in other parts of the world. And lastly, the economic impact of this war among workers and poor and oppressed people inside the United States, I believe, will drive them to resist the Biden administration. They have turned away from any discussion of justice and policing acts, of social spending, of raising the minimum wage. And now all we hear coming out of the administration is the notion that they have to defeat Russia that they have to arm Ukraine, and this is essential in order to maintain any type of stability in the world. And this is a very dangerous position to take. And we know also that they have their guns aimed at China as well. So I think NATO cannot prevail in this conflict if there is to be any hope for world peace in the coming years.
Thanks, Abayumi. You took the words right out of my mouth. I hope that that does not happen. I have Chris and then Jenny. Please go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Very briefly, Comrade Radhika. Well, I think part of the questions have been put forward by the previous speaker. But for me, one of the key things is that, you see, imperialism for capitalism has internal contradictions. At the point where we are now, that the majority of the European and other developed nations are sending arms to the Ukraine. In the long run, how is that going to play itself out? That goes to the question that Carlos was asking. So I see those internal contradictions manifesting in different spheres and areas where the different interests are going to clash, whether it's Germany's interest for gas to sustain its economy and et cetera, or elsewhere. So I'm inclined to want to agree with the point that's made that these internal contradictions are going to overwhelm imperialism in its military form via NATO and are going to, at some point, just cave in. To what extent and et cetera, that, well, at least I cannot tell it at this point. But I also want to agree with the point that Ellen is making. That's why I thought Comrade Jenny would come in very handy. Our experience in South Africa is that building the anti-apartheid movement took us time. Also, when the ANC was seen and construed as a terrorist organization elsewhere outside of the world, it became important for us to maneuver a whole range of other interpretations about what the ANC was, its struggle, killing white people when it was undertaking an armed struggle for purposes of national liberation and all of those things, when it was sourcing hardware from the Soviet Union, the ANC was a communist organization, and all of those things. So the broad peace movement, as we anticipate, must continue to stay broad and bring a whole range of forces into play based around the interpretation and the primacy of peace. And then we can do the other things on the sideline of building proper consciousness and understandings of the parameters for which that can be advanced. That we think is an important issue to continue to. We will not resolve it today, tomorrow, but it's a matter that we must continue to talk about and exchange around. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Now, since there are no further questions, I'm going to give Jenny the last word, and then we'll wrap up because we have been going for 2 hours and 15 minutes. So that's about as much as I think people should have to do on a Sunday morning or afternoon or evening, as the case may be. So Jenny, you have the last word.
Thanks, Radhika. So on the question of the worst case and the best case scenario, so for the worst case scenario, I think it's just, prolonging of the war, disruption by the war and sanctions, and increasing instability across the world. Instability, of course, always gives an opportunity for the United States to interfere and to bring down governments that aren't following its prescriptions. And I've been thinking about this whole question about whether we should call the new scenario a new Cold War. The Cold War, of course, from a European point of view, brought stability, and it froze Europe. Obviously, it was proxy wars elsewhere in the world. But I think that what we're seeing now is also the destabilization of Europe. And, so this is going to be, how far can Europe go? Can Germany really commit suicide commit economic suicide. And somebody was talking about a cartoon in the that they saw the other day. Well, there was a cartoon in the Financial Times. I just can't find Friday's Financial Times, which had the West, and then it had the two ogres of Russia and China in the background, and they're so equating Russia with China. But are they going to be able to get away with it? One, because Germany might be able to cut off its energy from Russia, but can it really cut itself off from the China market? China's going to be a completely different kettle of fish, and maybe, just maybe, some of the liberals in the West might say, well, we've seen all of these arguments in relation to Russia, but can we just transpose those to China, without having any discussion about that? On the question of what the peace movement should do, and I'll just do the other another point that I wanted to make, because I'll end on the positive. I mean, the other response that I wanted to make to Alan about fascism is, of course, in this kind of topsy-turvy Alice in Wonderland world that we're in, we see the win, Orban's win in Hungary, and the amount of French people that voted for Marine Le Pen, and they're taking an anti-NATO and not wanting to be involved in the war. So it's a very, very, very contradictory situation that who was it? Was it Marx or Lenin who said the old is dying, but the new is waiting to be born? And in that gap between the two, goodness knows what can happen. On what the peace movement should do, and this is also a best case scenario, I think, is to raise questions about this assertion that Ukraine has the democratic right to choose its foreign policy. I had to speak on a motion, was an extremely bad motion on the Ukraine at my Labour Party branch, which is very, very centrist and very, very social democratic and very, very pro-Keir Starmer. And I thought, if I mention NATO, I'm going to get kicked out of the Labour Party. So how can I make my point without mentioning NATO? And so I said, is it right that all countries have the democratic right to do whatever they want? Is it do countries have the right to pollute the planet? Do countries have does Australia have the right to get nuclear powered submarines? And do we have the right to sell nuclear powered submarines? And then people think, oh yeah, maybe it's a bit more complicated than that. And then we come to the idea of common security. And I think that we have to ram home this idea of common security. Security does not lie in arming yourselves to the teeth. Security does not lie in having bad relations with your neighbor, no matter how different or horrible you think they are. You can't move house, you can't get a divorce, you live next to them, get on with it and find out what you can do together. And I think that we have to focus on this notion that our security is in common, our security is shared. When we look at the pandemic, when we look at climate change, and this is the other side of the equation of the UN Charter. And I think that we have to, as people have said, uphold the UN Charter. Maybe I'm in a minority here. I am critical of what Russia has done. It's done multipolarity no good at all. Countries can't go around invading each other. It's a no-no. But equally, countries need to be working together to create a peaceful environment so that everyone can get on with meeting the challenges, with overcoming poverty, and with development. So I think that I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Jenny. I'll just close by saying two things. The quotation you were thinking of was from Gramsci. The crisis consists in the fact that the old order is dying and the new one cannot be born. And in the interregnum, a whole variety of morbid symptoms appear, which kind of sums up what you were, I think, where we are at. And quickly, the second one, I think the real hypocrisy, the staggering hypocrisy of saying that this war is about NATO, Ukraine's sovereign right to join NATO, is in fact the very people who are standing up for this alleged right are refusing to grant NATO and cannot grant Ukraine that membership of NATO, because the membership of NATO is divided and no country whose borders are disputed can join NATO. So what are they talking about? They are clearly talking from both sides of their mouth in order to keep the war festering. Folks, there's so much more to talk about. I'm sure we will be discussing this under the similar things under different formats in the near future. I'm afraid, I hope that this war ends very soon. Nobody needs wars, but it is quite possible that it won't. And in any case, even if it does end, we will be discussing what is to happen after that. So please watch out for our events. And thank you very much for staying. As usual, thanks to all the fantastic speakers for your perspectives. I don't think I can emphasize enough just how much expressing a different perspective is necessary right now, because this is not being expressed by the mainstream media. So we are getting, there were over 100 people in the meeting today, plus our YouTube videos are watched over and over again. So we are spreading the word. Thank you very much. And have a very good rest of the day, or I suppose in some cases, hope you have a good night. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.